Sometimes, the worst storms bring us exactly where we need to be. Sometimes, the people who save us are the ones who need saving most. In the winter of 1887, a widow named Mary Catherine sat in an abandoned cabin with her 3 children, watching their last candle burn down. They had been surviving on melted snow and prayers for weeks. Her fingers clutched a simple gold wedding ring. The only reminder of the husband fever had taken 2 months before. Miles away, Thomas Whitmore lived alone in the mountains. He had sworn off human contact after losing his family years before. But when he found footprints in the snow leading to that cabin, everything changed. What started as a simple act of mercy became something neither of them expected. In a world where survival meant trusting no one, 2 broken people discovered that sometimes the greatest risk is letting someone care. But will their growing bond be strong enough to survive the dangers closing in around them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of death. Mary Catherine pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked at her 3 children huddled together on the single blanket they shared. Samuel, at 12, tried to be the man of the family now, his thin shoulders squared against responsibility too heavy for his years. 8-year-old Rebecca clutched a cornhusk doll her mother had made weeks ago. Its painted face now faded and worn. Little James, barely 4, slept fitfully against his sister's side, his small body shivering despite their combined warmth. The cabin had been abandoned when they found it, a trapper's shelter left to rot when its owner either moved on or met his end in these unforgiving mountains. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the wind found every crack in the chinked logs. Mary Catherine had done her best to seal the gaps with mud and old rags. But winter in the Rocky Mountains was a relentless enemy. She remembered the hope in her husband's eyes when he'd spoken of Colorado territory. "Gold in them hills, Mary, Cat," he'd said, using the pet name that once made her heart flutter. "We'll make our fortune and build you the finest house in Denver." Now David lay buried beneath a cairn of stones 2 days' walk from here, his dreams frozen in the ground. With his body, they had been traveling to the mining camp at Silver Creek when the fever took him. One day he was planning their future. The next he was burning with heat that no amount of mountain stream water could cool. She had nursed him for 4 days in a grove of aspens, watching helplessly as the man she loved slipped away. The children had stood quiet and solemn as she spoke words over his grave, Samuel holding James while Rebecca picked wildflowers to lay on the stones. That was in late September. Now it was January, and the world had turned white and deadly. Mary Catherine rose from her spot by the dying fire and moved to the single window, its glass cracked and patched with oiled paper. Snow fell in thick curtains, erasing the world beyond. The glass, they had eaten the last of their hardtack 3 days ago, and the bag of cornmeal was down to less than a cup. She had been rationing their food for weeks, telling the children she wasn't hungry so they could have a little more. The wedding ring on her finger caught what little light came through the window. She had been twisting it unconsciously, the way she did when she prayed or worried or missed David so badly her chest ached. It was a simple band, nothing fancy, but he had saved for months to buy it from the jeweler in St. Louis. "From my Mary Cat," he had said when he slipped it on her finger. "So everyone knows you're spoken for." Now she was nobody's Mary Cat. She was just Mary Catherine Fletcher, widow, mother of 3, slowly freezing to death in a stranger's cabin. 5 miles away, through the howling storm, Thomas Whitmore sat in a cabin that couldn't have been more different. His home was solid, built with care and skill over the course of many years. The logs were thick and well chinked, the roof tight and strong. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, radiating steady heat throughout the single large room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and supplies. Smoked meat hung from the rafters, and barrels of flour, beans, and other staples stood ready to last the winter and beyond. Thomas himself was a study in solitude. 43 years old, with graying hair and a beard he kept neat out of old habit. He moved through his daily routines with the precision of a man who had lived alone for 15 years. Every morning he checked his snares, tended his horse in the Linta stable, and maintained his equipment. Every evening he read by firelight, usually the same few books he had read countless times before. Hidden beneath his mattress, wrapped in oilcloth, was a hand-carved wooden cross. He had whittled it during the long nights after Anna and Lucy died, back when he still believed prayers might reach heaven from these mountains. He hadn't looked at it in years, but he couldn't bring himself to burn it either. It remained there, like a splinter in his heart, a reminder of everything he had lost. Thomas had come to these mountains in 1872, after smallpox took his wife and 6-year-old daughter in the span of a week. He had been a cavalry sergeant then, stationed at Fort Collins, and the disease had swept through the town like wildfire. He held Lucy as she died, her small hand in his, promising her that Mama was waiting for her in heaven. When it was over, when he had buried them both in the post cemetery, he had walked away from his uniform, his rank, and his life. The mountains had been his refuge and his prison ever since. He spoke to no one except the occasional trader who brought supplies in exchange for the furs Thomas trapped. He had become a ghost. A legend whispered about in the towns below, the hermit who lived where no sane man would dare. But Thomas was sane. Painfully, brutally sane. He knew exactly what he had lost and exactly why he chose to live alone. People died. People you loved died, and the pain of losing them was worse than any physical wound. Better to live alone, need no one, love no one. Better to be empty than broken. His cabin was warm, his belly full, his life predictable and safe. He had everything he needed and wanted nothing more. At least, that's what he told himself every morning when he woke up alone. Every evening when he went to sleep alone. Every long winter night when the silence grew so complete, it seemed to press against his eardrums. On this particular evening, Thomas sat by his fire reading a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, Anna's favorite book. Though he had never told her he kept it. The wind rattled his windows, but they held firm. His fire crackled cheerfully, and his supper sat warm in his belly. Tomorrow he would check the snares on the eastern ridge, where the deer paths crossed the creek. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would change everything. That tomorrow he would find footprints in the snow, small ones, desperate ones, that would lead him to a choice he thought he would never have to make again. The storm raged on, and in 2 separate cabins, 2 survivors of loss lived through another night. One warm and secure, but hollow with solitude. The other cold and desperate, but rich with love that refused to surrender to the grave. Neither knew that morning would bring them face to face with the possibility that sometimes, in the deepest winter, spring could still find a way to bloom. The wind howled, the snow fell, and time moved toward a moment that would reshape both their worlds. Mary Catherine twisted her wedding ring and whispered a prayer for morning. Thomas read poetry by firelight and tried not to remember the sound of his daughter's laughter. Both were about to discover that some things in life are worth the risk of caring again. The morning broke cold and crystalline, the kind of day that made the mountains look like God's own cathedral. Thomas stepped out of his cabin into snow that came up past his knees, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. He had planned to check the eastern snares, but something drew him west instead, a restlessness he couldn't name. A feeling that had been growing stronger with each passing hour. He strapped on his snowshoes and shouldered his rifle, then set out through the pristine drifts. The snow crunched beneath his feet with that particular sound winter makes when the temperature drops well below zero. Everything was white and silent except for the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Thomas had been walking for nearly an hour when he saw them tracks in the snow that made him stop dead in his tracks. 4 sets of footprints, crossing his path at an angle that would take them toward the old trapper's cabin on Willow Creek. But these weren't the tracks of trappers or hunters. These were the footprints of desperation. 2 sets were adult-sized but light, as if made by someone who didn't weigh much anymore. The other 2 were small children's feet. He realized with a jolt that went through his chest like a physical blow. 1 set was so tiny it could only belong to a very young child, and they were all heading toward a cabin that had been abandoned. For 3 years, Thomas followed the tracks, his heart pounding harder with each step. The snow told him a story he didn't want to read. The footprints wandered sometimes, as if the people making them were weak or confused. In one place, he could see where someone had fallen and struggled to get back up. There were drops of blood on the snow-dark spots that made his stomach clench with worry. When he reached the ridge overlooking Willow Creek, he could see smoke rising from the chimney of the old cabin. Thin, weak smoke, as if the fire inside was barely hanging on to life. Thomas crouched behind a stand of pine trees and studied the scene below. The cabin looked ready to fall down, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, its walls dark with weather and neglect. But someone was alive in there. Someone who had managed to get a fire started and keep it burning. Thomas made his way down the slope, moving quietly out of habit rather than any fear of the people inside. As he got closer, he could see that efforts had been made to seal some of the gaps in the cabin walls with what looked like pieces of clothing. A strip of blue fabric, maybe part of a dress, had been stuffed into a crack near the door. He was 20 feet from the cabin when he saw it. A child's shoe, worn thin and crusted with ice, half buried in the snow beside the path. It was so small it couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 4 or 5. Thomas picked it up with hands that shook slightly, and for a moment he was transported back 15 years to Lucy's bedroom, to the tiny shoes lined up beside her bed, waiting for feet that would never fill them again. The shoe in his hands was evidence of suffering that cut him to the bone. Some child was in that cabin, and that child was missing a shoe in weather that could kill a grown man. Thomas approached the door and knocked. 3 firm raps that echoed in the thin mountain air. "Who's there?" The voice was female, frightened, with the particular edge that comes from someone who's been pushed beyond their limits. "Name's Thomas Whitmore," he called back. "I live up on Bear Ridge. I saw your smoke." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines. Then he heard voices inside, a woman's voice, urgent and low, speaking to what sounded like children. "We don't want any trouble, mister," the woman said finally. "We're just waiting out the storm." "Ma'am, I found a child's shoe in the snow," Thomas said, holding up the small, frozen thing. "Someone in there needs help." Another long silence, then the sound of something heavy being moved away from the door. When it opened, Thomas found himself looking at a woman who might have been pretty once, before hunger and worry carved lines in her face and put shadows under her eyes. Her dress was patched and mended, and she wrapped a thin shawl around shoulders that seemed too narrow to carry all the weight she was bearing. Behind her, 3 pairs of eyes stared at him from the gloom of the cabin. A boy of maybe 12 stood protectively in front of his younger siblings, his chin raised in unconscious imitation of adult courage. A little girl with tangled hair clutched a worn doll against her chest. And there, barefoot in the bitter cold, stood the child who belonged to the shoe in Thomas's hand, a little boy whose lips had a blue tinge that made Thomas's heart race with alarm. "Ma'am," Thomas said, his voice gentler than it had been in 15 years, "that little one needs shoes. And from the looks of things, you all need more help than this old place can provide." Mary Catherine's pride warred with her desperation, and Thomas could see the battle playing out across her face. She lifted her chin, and for a moment He thought she might refuse. "We're managing just fine," she said, but her voice cracked on. "The words, 'I'm sure you are,'" Thomas replied. "But managing and thriving are two different things." He held out the tiny shoe. "This belongs to someone who matters to you. Let me help." The little boy took a step forward, his eyes fixed on his shoe. "That's mine," he said in a voice so small it barely carried across the threshold. Thomas knelt down in the snow, bringing himself to the child's eye level. "I know it is, son. And it's too cold for anyone to be walking around with only one shoe." He looked up at Mary Catherine, seeing the moment when her resolve finally cracked. "Ma'am, I've got a warm cabin, plenty of food and room enough for all of you. You coming inside?" It wasn't really a question, and they all knew it. Mary Catherine looked at her children, at Samuel trying to be brave, at Rebecca clutching her doll, at little James shivering despite the fire behind them. She looked at the stranger kneeling in the snow, holding her son's shoe like it was something precious. "I don't even know you," she whispered. "No," Thomas agreed, standing slowly. "But you know your children need help, and you know this place won't keep you alive much longer." He gestured toward the sagging roof, the patched walls. "I'm offering shelter, food, and warmth. No strings attached." Mary Catherine closed her eyes, and Thomas saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer. When she opened them again, something had changed in her face. "Children," she said quietly, "gather what you can carry." Thomas nodded and stepped back, to give them room. As the family began to move, collecting their meager possessions, he felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 15 years. It felt like ice beginning to crack after a long, hard winter dotted. Felt like the first tentative possibility of spring. The walk to Thomas's cabin took nearly 2 hours, with the children struggling through snow that sometimes came up to their waists. Thomas had fashioned a crude sled from pine boughs to carry their few possessions, and twice he had to lift little James and carry him when the boy's strength gave out completely. Mary Catherine walked in silence, her jaw set with the kind of determination that comes from having no other choice. When Thomas's cabin finally came into view, Mary Catherine stopped, so suddenly that Rebecca bumped into her from behind. The building before them was everything their abandoned shelter was not solid. Well-built, with smoke rising steadily from a stone chimney. Windows glowed with warm light, and the door looked like it would actually keep the wind out. "This is your home?" Samuel asked, speaking for the first time since they had left the other cabin. "Has been for 15 years, Thomas replied, opening the door and gesturing them inside. The warmth hit them like a physical force, and little James immediately began pulling off his coat. The cabin was a single large room, but it felt spacious, rather than cramped. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, crackling with a fire that had been banked but not allowed to die. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and supplies that spoke of a man who planned ahead. The smell of wood smoke and something savory cooking in a pot over the fire made Mary Catherine's stomach clench with hunger. "Sit by the fire," Thomas said, gesturing toward a rough-hewn bench and a pair of chairs. "All of you. Get warm while I see about some food." Mary Catherine wanted to protest, to insist that she could help, but she was so tired and cold that she simply sank onto the bench beside her children. Rebecca curled up against her mother's side, while Samuel sat straight-backed, his eyes taking in every detail of their surroundings. James crawled directly to the hearth and held his hands out to the flames, sighing with relief that was heartbreaking in its simple gratitude. Thomas ladled stew from the pot into wooden bowls, the rich smell filling the cabin with promises of warmth and satisfaction. When he handed the first bowl to James, the little boy looked up at him with eyes that held wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe food this good was real. "Thank you," Mary Catherine said quietly when Thomas handed her a bowl. The words seemed inadequate, but they were all she had. "Eat first," Thomas replied. "We can talk after everyone's had their fill." They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft scraping of spoons against bowls. Thomas watched them carefully, noting how thin they had become, how the children's clothes hung loose on their small frames. When little James dozed off right there on the hearth, his empty bowl still clutched in his hands, Thomas gently lifted the boy and carried him to his own bed in the corner of the cabin. "He can sleep there tonight," Thomas said when Mary Catherine started to protest. "I've got blankets enough for everyone." As the evening settled around them, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Mary Catherine helped Thomas clean the bowls, moving carefully around the unfamiliar space, while Samuel and Rebecca sat by the fire, their energy returning with warmth and food. It was Samuel who noticed the military medal first, partially hidden behind a stack of books on one of the shelves. The brass caught the firelight, and the boy's curiosity got the better of his manners. "Were you a soldier?" Samuel asked, pointing to the medal. Thomas followed his gaze and felt his chest tighten. He had forgotten the medal was visible, forgotten that having other people in his space meant they would see things he usually kept hidden. "Long time ago?" he said simply. "My pa was going to be a soldier," Samuel continued, his young voice carrying a weight of loss, "before the fever took him." Mary Catherine looked up sharply, but Thomas simply nodded. "Takes courage to serve." "Your pa sounds like he was a brave man." "He was," Samuel said, his shoulders straightening with pride. "He said a man's got to protect what matters most." "He was right about that," Thomas replied, and something in his voice made Mary Catherine study his face more carefully. She was beginning to see that this quiet man carried his own sorrows, his own carefully guarded losses. "Where will we sleep?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and uncertain. Thomas looked around his cabin, mentally rearranging 15 years of solitary living. "Well, little James has claimed my bed for tonight, which is just fine. I can make up pallets here by the fire for you and your brother. It'll be warm and comfortable." "And me?" Mary Catherine asked. Thomas gestured toward a curtained area near the back of the cabin. "There's a small alcove back there where I keep my winter gear. I can clear it out, hang a proper curtain for privacy. It's not much, but it's warm and private." Mary Catherine nodded, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. In the abandoned cabin, they had all huddled together for warmth. Here, Thomas was offering them dignity along with shelter. "This is temporary," she said suddenly, needing to establish that boundary. "Just until the weather breaks. Until we can figure out what comes next." "Of course," Thomas agreed, though something flickered across his face that might have been disappointment. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Samuel stood and walked over to the shelf with the medal, studying it more closely. "You were cavalry," he observed, reading the inscription. "7th Cavalry, stationed at Fort Collins," Thomas confirmed. 15 years ago. Why did you leave?" the boy asked with the directness that only children possess. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the fire. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Sometimes a man finds he's lost everything that made the fight worthwhile." Mary Catherine understood then, with the intuition of someone who had walked through her own valley of loss. This man had loved someone once, had lost them, and had come to these mountains to nurse wounds that never quite healed. Just like she had twisted her wedding ring and clung to David's memory, Thomas had built this solitary life as a monument to whatever he had lost. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw recognition. Passed between them the recognition of one survivor to another. "We all carry what we need to carry," he said finally. As they prepared for sleep, Thomas moving efficiently to set up pallets and arrange blankets, Mary Catherine found herself watching him with new eyes. This was a man who had known love and loss, who had chosen solitude over the risk of being hurt again. But here he was, opening his home to strangers, making room in his carefully ordered life for 3 children and a woman he had never met before. Today dawned when little James stirred in the big bed, calling out softly for his mama. Thomas paused in his preparations and listened until the boy settled back into sleep. The tenderness in that simple gesture told Mary Catherine more about her host than hours of conversation might have revealed. They were all damaged goods. She realized she and her children, and this quiet mountain man who had chosen to save them. But sometimes, she thought as she settled onto the soft pallet Thomas had prepared, damaged goods could still find ways to be useful to each other. Outside, the wind continued to howl. But inside Thomas's cabin, 4 people who had been strangers that morning fell asleep warm, fed, and safe. It was more than Mary Catherine had dared hope for in weeks. It was, she thought drowsily, the first real gift they had received since David died. Mary Catherine woke before dawn, a habit formed from years of early morning chores and reinforced by weeks of anxious vigilance. The cabin was warm and quiet, filled with the soft sounds of peaceful sleep. Thomas sat in a chair by the dying fire, a rifle across his knees, watching over them all like a guardian angel carved from mountain stone. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, rising from her pallet and moving to sit beside him. "Sleep light in winter," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Old habits." Mary Catherine studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the lines of weariness around his eyes, the careful way he held himself even in rest. "You don't have to stand guard over us. We're safe here." Thomas looked at her then, and she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his expression before it disappeared behind his usual mask of quiet control. "Safe is something you earn every day in these mountains. Can't take it for granted." She understood. Safety had been something she had taken for granted too, back when David was alive, back when they had plans and dreams and a future that stretched out bright and certain before them. Now she knew how quickly everything could change, how fragile the things we count on really are. "I should help with breakfast," she said, starting to rise. Thomas shook his head. "You're a guest. Rest while you can." "I'm not a guest," Mary Catherine said firmly. "I'm a woman with 3 children who's accepting charity from a stranger. The least I can do is earn our keep." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, surprise, maybe, or respect. He nodded slowly. "Kitchen's yours then. Coffee's in the blue tin, eggs are in the cold box outside the door." Working together in the quiet pre-dawn hour, they moved around each other with surprising ease. Mary Catherine found herself studying the man who had rescued them, noting the efficient way he built up the fire, the careful attention he paid to every task. Among her few possessions was a half-finished quilt she had been working on during the long evenings in St. Louis, before David got the gold fever, before everything changed. She had brought it west, thinking she would finish it in their new home, wherever that might be. Now it seemed like a relic from someone else's life. "Tell me about them," Thomas said, nodding toward the sleeping children as he sliced bacon with practiced precision. Mary Catherine smiled, her face softening. "Samuel tries to be the man of the family now. He's got his father's stubborn streak and twice his courage. Rebecca sees beauty everywhere, even in the worst circumstances. She's the artist of the family, always drawing pictures or making up stories. And James," her voice caught slightly, "James still believes everything will be all right. He still has that faith that children have, you know? That the adults in his life will fix whatever's wrong." "That's a precious thing," Thomas said quietly. "That kind of trust." "It's also a terrible responsibility," Mary Catherine replied. "Keeping that faith alive when you're not sure you believe it yourself anymore." The smell of bacon cooking began to fill the cabin, and one by one, the children stirred. James was first, padding over to the fire in stocking feet, his hair standing up in all directions. He climbed onto Thomas's lap without invitation, settling there as naturally as if he had been doing it all his life. "Morning, little man," Thomas said, and Mary Catherine caught the note of wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe this small person trusted him so completely. Rebecca appeared next, clutching her cornhusk doll and rubbing sleep from her eyes. She had been working on a drawing the night before, using a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and the back of an old letter. Now she shyly showed it to Thomas, a picture of his cabin with smoke rising from the chimney and 4 stick figures standing in front of it. "That's us," she explained. "That's you and Mama and Samuel and James and me." Thomas studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "It's beautiful, Rebecca. You've got a real talent." The little girl beamed, and Mary Catherine felt her heart clench at how hungry her daughter was for approval, for adult attention that wasn't worried or distracted by survival. Samuel was last to rise, moving with the careful dignity of someone trying to navigate the space between childhood and responsibility. He helped serve breakfast without being asked, and Mary Catherine noticed how Thomas included him in small decisions: where to stack the firewood, which pot to use for the coffee. After breakfast, Thomas announced his intention to check his trap lines. "Take most of the day," he said. "You're welcome to whatever you need here. Can I come with you?" Samuel asked eagerly. Thomas considered this, weighing the boy's eagerness against the dangers of the mountain winter. "It's cold work, and we'll be out for hours." "I'm not afraid of cold," Samuel said, lifting his chin. "And I want to learn. Pa always said a man should know how to provide for his family." Mary Catherine started to protest Samuel was still a child, still her responsibility to protect, but something in Thomas's expression stopped her. "All right then," Thomas said. "But you follow my lead, do exactly as I say, and speak only when I tell you it's safe." Samuel nodded solemnly, understanding that this was more than just a walk in the woods. This was a test, a chance to prove himself worthy of adult trust. After the two of them left, Mary Catherine found herself alone in the cabin with Rebecca and James for the first time in weeks without the constant worry of immediate survival. The children played quietly by the fire while she explored their temporary home more thoroughly. She found evidence everywhere of a man who had lived alone for a very long time. Everything organized with military precision, everything chosen for function over beauty. But she also found small traces of a different life, carefully preserved. A woman's hair ribbon in a drawer, a child's small moccasin tucked behind a stack of books. Rebecca came to stand beside her when she discovered the ribbon, a piece of blue silk that had once been fine. "Whose is that, Mama?" Rebecca asked. "I think it belonged to someone Mr. Thomas cared about very much," Mary Catherine said softly. "Someone who isn't here anymore." Rebecca nodded with the solemn acceptance children have for life's mysteries. "Like Papa." "Yes, sweetheart, like Papa." That evening, when Thomas and Samuel returned with 2 rabbits and a wealth of stories about animal tracks and mountain weather, Mary Catherine watched her son's face glow with pride and excitement. For the first time since David's death, Samuel looked like a boy instead of a man carrying burdens too heavy for his shoulders. As they sat around the fire after supper, Rebecca working on a new drawing while James dozed in Thomas's lap again, Mary Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too much to ask for, but a sense that they were safe, fed, and cared for. It was more than she had dared hope for, and it scared her almost as much as it comforted her, because she was beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing about accepting Thomas's help wasn't the debt it created. It was how easy it would be to start counting on it. It was Rebecca who found the letter, 3 weeks after they had arrived at Thomas's cabin. She had been looking for paper to draw on when she accidentally knocked over a small wooden box tucked behind Thomas's books. The contents spilled across the floor: a few coins, some old buttons, and a folded piece of paper that had been read so many times the creases were wearing through. Mary Catherine was helping James with his boots when Rebecca brought the letter to her, her young face serious, with the weight of having discovered something important. "Mama, I think this belongs to Mr. Thomas," she said quietly. It fell out of his special box. Mary Catherine took the letter, intending to set it aside for Thomas to find later, but the feminine handwriting caught her eye. The paper was old and soft with handling, and she could see it had been folded and unfolded countless times. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began, and Mary Catherine quickly looked away, her cheeks burning with shame. But something about the careful way the letter had been preserved, the reverent way it had been handled, made her understand that this was more than just correspondence. This was a relic, a sacred thing. When Thomas returned from checking his snares that evening, Mary Catherine approached him quietly while the children played by the fire. "Rebecca accidentally knocked over a box earlier," she said, holding out the letter. "This fell out." Thomas took the letter, his face going very still. For a moment, Mary Catherine thought he might be angry, but then she saw the careful way he folded the paper, the gentle way his fingers traced the edges. Her name was Anna, he said finally, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "My wife. She wrote this the day before she took sick." Mary Catherine waited, sensing that if she spoke now, the moment would be lost. "She was planting a garden," Thomas continued, still looking down at the letter. "Wrote me this note telling me all the flowers she wanted to plant come spring. Daffodils by the kitchen window, roses along the fence. She had it all planned out." He looked up then, his eyes meeting Mary Catherine's. "She died 6 days later. Lucy, our daughter, died the day after that." The pain in his voice was so raw, so immediate, that Mary Catherine felt it in her own chest like a physical blow. She thought of her own losses, her own carefully guarded memories of David, and recognized the particular grief of someone who had lost not just a person, but a whole imagined future. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more than she had ever meant those words before. "I kept thinking I should plant that garden," Thomas said, his thumb tracing the letter's edge again. "Every spring for 15 years, I've thought about it. But it seemed wrong somehow, planting her flowers without her there to see them bloom." Mary Catherine understood. She had been carrying David's dreams the same way, holding on to his vision of Colorado gold and a fine house in Denver, even though those dreams had died with him. Some losses were too precious to let go of, even when holding on to them kept you from living. What would she want you to do? Mary Catherine asked gently. Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier. "She'd want me to plant the whole mountainside with flowers if it made me happy." Anna wasn't one for wallowing in sorrow. That night, as they sat around the fire, Thomas began to talk about his life before the mountains. He told them about Anna's laugh, about Lucy's fascination with butterflies, about the small house near Fort Collins where they had planned to grow old together. The children listened with rapt attention, and Mary Catherine found herself sharing stories too, memories of David's terrible jokes, his optimism that never seemed to dim even when things went wrong, the way he used to sing off-key while he shaved Dot. It was the first time since David's death that talking about him didn't feel like reopening a wound. Instead, it felt like honoring something precious, like polishing a treasured possession until it gleamed. "Papa used to tell us stories about knights and dragons," Rebecca said, curling up against Mary Catherine's side. "He said brave knights always protected the people they loved." "Your papa was right about that," Thomas said, his eyes moving to Samuel, who had grown quiet during the conversation. "What about you, son? What do you remember best about your father?" Samuel was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of grief that was still too fresh, still too sharp. "He promised he'd teach me to be a man," He promised we'd build our house together, that he'd show me how to use tools and care for horses, and his voice broke, and he wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears. Thomas leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Those are good promises, the kind a father should make to his son. But he's not here to keep them, Samuel said, anger and sorrow mixing in his young voice. No, Thomas agreed. He's not. But that doesn't mean the promises die with him. Mary, Catherine watched as something passed between the man and the boy, an understanding that went deeper than words. Thomas wasn't offering to replace David. He was offering to honor David's memory by helping Samuel become the man his father had wanted him to be. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like a family. Thomas included Samuel in more of the daily work checking. Traps, maintaining equipment, caring for the horse. The boy thrived under the attention, his confidence growing with each task he mastered. Rebecca filled the cabin with her drawings, transforming the stark walls into a gallery of mountain life, seen through a child's wonder-filled eyes. James attached himself to Thomas with the single-minded devotion of a 4-year-old, following him around the cabin and chattering constantly about everything and nothing. Mary Catherine found herself watching Thomas with new eyes, seeing past the careful walls he had built around his heart. She noticed how he unconsciously gentled his voice when speaking to the children, how he made sure James had the choicest bits of meat at dinner, how he listened with complete attention when Rebecca explained her latest artistic creation. One evening, as she mended a tear in Samuel's coat by the firelight, she became aware that Thomas was watching her with the same careful attention she had been paying to him. When their eyes met across the cabin, something electric passed between them, a recognition that went beyond gratitude or convenience. Mary Catherine, he said, and the way he spoke her name made her breath catch. It had been months since anyone had said it like that, like it mattered, like she mattered beyond her role as mother and caretaker. Yes, she managed to say. When spring comes, he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. What are your plans? When the snow melts and the pass is clear. The question she had been dreading, the future she had been trying not to think about. I don't know, she admitted. Find work somewhere, I suppose. There must be places that need a woman who can cook and clean and mend. What about the children's schooling? Mary Catherine's hands stilled on her mending. It was a luxury she hadn't dared consider. Education for her children when she wasn't sure she could keep them fed and sheltered. I can teach them their letters, she said finally. David and I both had some schooling. It's not much, but it's something. Thomas nodded slowly, and she could see him thinking, weighing something in his mind. There are books here, he said. Finally, more books than one man needs. And the winters are long. Plenty of time for learning, if someone was minded to stay. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Mary Catherine understood what he was offering, not just shelter for the winter, but a home, a future, a chance at something she hadn't dared dream of since David died. Thomas, she said carefully, you don't owe us anything more than you've already given. This isn't about owing, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. This is about. He struggled for words. This man who had lived in silence for so long. This is about waking up in the morning and remembering what it feels like to have something worth protecting again. Mary Catherine felt her heart begin to race, felt the careful walls she had built around her own feelings begin to crumble. She looked at her children, Samuel, reading one of Thomas's books by the fire, Rebecca sketching in her endless supply of drawings, James fast asleep with his head pillowed on Thomas's leg, and saw something she had thought was lost forever. She saw a family. Not the family she had planned or the family she had lost, but a family nonetheless. Different, unexpected, built from the ashes of old griefs, but real and precious and possible. But she also saw the danger in hoping for too much, in letting herself believe that happiness could be trusted not to disappear again. "I should think about it," she said finally. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of what he had offered and what she would have to risk to accept it. Spring's still months away. No need to decide anything now. But as Mary Catherine returned to her mending, she knew the decision was already being made in her heart, one careful stitch at a time. February arrived with a week of bitter cold that made even Thomas's well-built cabin creak and groan under the assault. The windows frosted over so thickly that the outside world disappeared entirely, leaving them cocooned in firelight in each other's company. It was during these long, intimate evenings that the careful boundaries between them began to blur. Thomas had taken to carving in the evenings, his hands moving with practiced skill as he shaped pieces of pine and oak into useful things. He made Rebecca a set of drawing pencils from charcoal and willow twigs, bound together with strips of leather. For Samuel, he crafted a hunting knife with a handle carved from deer antler, complete with a sheath that bore the boy's initials. But it was the gift he made for James that revealed the depth of his transformation. Working in secret after the little boy had gone to sleep, Thomas carved a perfect replica of a horse, not just any horse, but the gentle Mari that lived in his lean-to stable. Every detail was perfect, from the flowing mane to the kind eyes that seemed almost alive in the flickering firelight. When he presented it to James over breakfast, the little boy's face lit up with pure joy. "It's Buttercup," he exclaimed, naming the Mare with the casual confidence of childhood. "She's beautiful, Mr. Thomas." "Thank you." Mary Catherine watched Thomas's face as James threw his small arms around the man's neck in an enthusiastic hug, and she saw something crack open in his expression, a vulnerability so raw it made her chest ache. This was a man remembering what it felt like to be loved unconditionally, to matter to someone small and precious. "You don't have to keep making things for them," she said later, as they cleaned up after supper. "You've already given us so much." Thomas paused in his work, a dish rag in his hands. "I want to," he said simply. "It's been 15 years since I had anyone to make things for. I'd forgotten." He stopped, seeming to search for words. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to have my work mean something to someone else." The intimacy of the confession made Mary Catherine's heart skip. They were standing close together in the small kitchen area, and she became suddenly aware of the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of pine sap and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "Thomas," she began, not sure what she meant to say. He turned to face her fully, and the space between them seemed to compress until she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the silver threads in his dark hair. "Mary Catherine," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and want. Mary Catherine found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something stronger than common sense or caution. Thomas's hand came up to touch her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. But then James called out from the bed, asking for water, and the spell was broken. They stepped apart quickly, both breathing a little too fast, both acutely aware of what had almost happened. The incident left them awkward around each other for several days, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. Mary Catherine found herself watching Thomas when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing the way his shoulders moved when he worked, the gentle way he spoke to her children. She caught him watching her too, his gaze following her as she moved around the cabin, as she read to the children by the fire, as she braided Rebecca's hair each morning. The tension between them was palpable, and Mary Catherine began to wonder if the children could sense it. Samuel certainly seemed to be watching them both with new interest, his 12-year-old mind working to understand the undercurrents he was witnessing. It was during one of their awkward, careful evenings that disaster nearly struck. Mary Catherine had been melting snow for washing when she knocked over the pot. sending boiling water cascading across the floor. Without thinking, she lunged forward to save Thomas's books from the sprinting water, but her foot slipped on the wet stones and she went down hard, her head striking the edge of the hearth. Thomas was beside her before she could even process what had happened, his hands gentle but urgent as he checked for serious injury. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, and her head rang like a church bell, but she was conscious and aware. "Easy," Thomas murmured, his voice tight with worry. "Just lie still for a moment." The children crowded around them, their faces white with fear. Rebecca began to cry, and James grabbed onto Thomas's arm as if he could anchor their small world against another catastrophe. "I'm all right," Mary Catherine said, struggling to sit up despite Thomas's restraining hand. "It's just a bump." But Thomas wasn't listening to her protests. With infinite care, he lifted her in his arms and carried her to his bed, settling her against the pillows with a tenderness that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with her injury. "Samuel, bring me the medical supplies from the blue chest," Thomas instructed, his voice calm and authoritative. "Rebecca, get me some clean water. James, you sit right here and talk to your mama while I fix her up." As Thomas cleaned and bandaged the cut on her forehead, Mary Catherine found herself studying his face, noting the concentration in his expression, the careful way he tried not to cause her any additional pain. His hands were steady and sure, and she realized he had done this before, tended wounds, cared for injured people. Another reminder of the man he had been before grief drove him to the mountains. "There," he said finally, tying off the bandage with gentle precision. "You'll have a headache for a day or two, but I don't think it's serious." "Thank you," Mary Catherine said, and the words carried weight beyond gratitude for medical attention. Thomas met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw everything he couldn't say: his fear at seeing her hurt, his relief that she was all right, his growing understanding that somewhere along the way she had become precious to him. That night, Thomas insisted on checking on her every few hours, making sure the injury wasn't more serious than it appeared. Each time he approached the bed, Mary Catherine pretended to be asleep, but she was acutely aware of his presence, of the way he adjusted her blankets or smoothed the pillow beneath her head. In the morning, when she woke to find a cup of willow bark tea waiting beside the bed, Thomas's remedy for her headache, she understood that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they had been maintaining was no longer possible. Whether they acknowledged it or not, they were no longer strangers sharing temporary shelter. They were becoming something else entirely, something that both thrilled and terrified them both. The first warm day in March brought with it a false promise of spring that fooled no one who truly understood mountain weather. But after months of bitter cold, even the illusion of warmth was enough to lift everyone's spirits. Thomas declared it a perfect day for checking the far trap lines, and Samuel begged to come along on what would be their longest expedition yet. Mary Catherine watched them go with mixed feelings, pride in how much Samuel had grown under Thomas's tutelage, and worry that never quite left her when her children were out of sight. She spent the morning with Rebecca and James, helping Rebecca with her letters while James played with his carved horse, making elaborate adventures around the cabin. It was while cleaning Thomas's desk that Mary Catherine found the folded paper tucked behind his inkwell. She almost put it back without looking. She had learned to respect Thomas's privacy after the incident with Anna's letter. But something about the official-looking seal caught her attention, and when she saw the word "reward" printed across the top, her blood turned to ice. The bounty notice was dated 6 months ago, offering $500 for information leading to the capture of David Fletcher, wanted for bank robbery in Kansas City. But it wasn't just David's name that made her sink into Thomas's chair with shaking hands. It was the detailed description that followed, and the additional reward offered for his wife and children, suspected accomplices who had fled west after the robbery. Mary Catherine stared at the paper, her mind reeling. David, her gentle husband who wouldn't hurt a soul, who had never even raised his voice to the children, a bank robber. The man who had told her they were traveling to Colorado to mine for gold legally had been running from the law. But even as part of her mind rejected the possibility, another part began to remember small inconsistencies. The hurried departure from Kansas City, David's nervousness whenever they passed through towns, the surprising amount of cash he had carried, more than a carpenter's wages should have provided. The way he had insisted they avoid the main trails, taking remote paths that added days to their journey. "Mama?" Rebecca's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Mama, you look funny." Mary Catherine quickly folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket, forcing a smile for her daughter. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking about something." But she wasn't fine. As the day wore on, as she mechanically went through the motions of caring for the children, her mind churned with terrible possibilities. If David had robbed that bank, if he had stolen that money, then where was it now? Had he hidden it somewhere? Along their journey? Had it been with him when he died? The questions multiplied until her head pounded with more than just the lingering effects of her injury. And underneath all the confusion and disbelief was a growing terror. If bounty hunters were looking for David Fletcher's family, if there was a price on their heads, then she had brought danger right to Thomas's door. When Thomas and Samuel returned that evening, flushed with cold and success, they had caught 3 rabbits and seen signs that spring was indeed coming. Mary Catherine could barely meet Thomas's eyes. Through supper, through the evening's quiet activities, the folded paper in her pocket felt like it was burning against her skin. It wasn't until after the children had gone to sleep that she found the courage to confront what she had discovered. Thomas was banking the fire for the night when she approached him, the bounty notice clutched in her trembling hands. "I found this," she said simply, holding out the paper. Thomas took it, unfolded it, and Mary Catherine watched his face change as he read. The warmth in his expression faded, replaced by the careful mask she hadn't seen since those first days. "How long have you known?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still on the paper. When he looked up, his face was grave, but not accusatory. "I suspected something when I first brought you here. A family traveling alone in winter, avoiding the main settlements. It suggested you were running from something. I found this notice when I went to trade for supplies 2 weeks ago." "Why didn't you say anything?" Mary Catherine's voice cracked with emotion. "Why didn't you turn us in?" Thomas set the paper on the table between them, his movements careful and deliberate. "Because I looked at you and your children, and I saw people who were suffering, not criminals who deserved to be hunted." "But David," Mary Catherine's voice broke completely. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Thomas, I had no idea he had stolen anything. He told me we were going to Colorado to mine for gold, that he had saved money for the journey. I thought," she pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back sobs, "I thought I knew who my husband was." Thomas came around the table and gently took her hands in his, pulling them away from her face. "Mary Catherine, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing no condemnation there, only compassion. "Whatever David did, whatever choices he made, they don't define who you are," Thomas said firmly. "You're not responsible for his actions. But the money," Mary Catherine whispered. "If he stole it, if it's hidden somewhere, do you know where it is?" Mary Catherine shook her head. "I don't even know if it exists. Maybe he spent it all on our journey west. Maybe it's buried with him. I don't know anything anymore." Thomas studied her face, and she could see him weighing her words, judging her honesty. After a long moment, he nodded. "I believe you. What are we going to do?" The question came out smaller than she had intended, heavy with fear for her children's future. Thomas picked up the bounty notice and walked to the fireplace. Without hesitation, he tossed it into the flames, watching as it caught and curled. into ash. "We're not going to do anything," he said, turning back to face her. "That paper never existed." David Fletcher died of fever on his way to the Colorado goldfields, leaving behind a widow and 3 children who had nothing to do with whatever trouble he might have caused. Mary Catherine stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You're destroying evidence. You could be charged with helping fugitives. Let me worry about that." Thomas's voice was steady. "Sure. You and the children are under my protection now. That means something. Thomas, you don't understand. If there are bounty hunters still looking for us, if they find us here, you could be killed just for harboring us. I won't let you risk your life for what? For what?" Thomas interrupted. "For you? For Samuel and Rebecca and James? Mary Catherine, these past months, living with you and the children, it's the first time in 15 years that I've felt alive. Again, I'm not going to let some bounty hunters take that away." The declaration hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying in its implications. Mary Catherine saw the truth in his eyes, saw that he meant every word, and felt her heart break and soar at the same time. "What if they come?" she whispered. Thomas's expression grew hard, and for a moment she glimpsed the cavalry soldier he had once been. "Then they'll find out that some things are worth fighting for." As they stood there in the firelight, surrounded by the ashes of David's crimes and the weight of an uncertain future, Mary Catherine understood that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Thomas had chosen them, chosen her over safety, over solitude, over the careful life he had built to protect himself from further lost thought. It was the most terrifying and wonderful gift anyone had ever given her, but it also meant that the peaceful winter cocoon they had built together was about to be tested in ways none of them could fully prepare for. The change in Thomas was immediate and unmistakable. The gentle mountain hermit who had carved toys and taught children to read transformed overnight into someone Mary Catherine had never seen before, a soldier preparing for war. The next morning, he disappeared into the back of the cabin and returned with items that made Mary Catherine's blood run cold. A wooden crate filled with weapons she hadn't known existed, military rifles, ammunition, a service revolver, and boxes of supplies that spoke of someone who had not forgotten how to fight. These were not hunting weapons. These were instruments of war, carefully maintained and ready for use. "How long do you think we have?" Mary Catherine asked, watching as Thomas methodically cleaned and checked each weapon. "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks, but they'll come." Thomas's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "That bounty's too big to ignore, and spring's coming. The passes will be clear enough for determined men to get through." He had spent the morning scouting the area around the cabin, and now he spread a rough map on the table, marking positions with small stones. 3 approaches to the cabin, he explained, his finger tracing the paths. The main trail from the east, the creek bed from the south, and the ridge path from the north. The west side is protected by a cliff face. No one's coming that way, unless they sprout wings. Samuel had been listening with wide eyes, his young face serious as he absorbed every word. "What can I do to help?" he asked. Thomas looked at the boy for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. "You can help me prepare the defensive positions." But Samuel, his voice grew stern. "When the time comes, your job is to protect your mother and siblings. That's not a child's job, it's a man's job. Do you understand?" Samuel nodded solemnly, and Mary Catherine felt her heart clench at how quickly her son was being forced to grow up. "Mary Catherine," Thomas continued, "I need to know, can you shoot?" The question caught her off guard. "I a little. David taught me to use his hunting rifle, but I'm not very good. We'll work on that. Rebecca, James, you two will need to know where to hide if bad men come visiting. Can you be brave for your mama and do exactly what she tells you?" Both children nodded, though James looked confused about what bad men might want with them. Over the next 3 days, Thomas transformed their peaceful home into a fortress. He showed Mary Catherine how to reload his rifles quickly, how to aim for center mass rather than trying for fancy shots. Her first attempts were clumsy, but determination and fear for her children's safety made her a fast learner. He created hiding places for the children, root cellar beneath the cabin floor that could be accessed through a hidden trapdoor, stocked with food, water, and warm blankets. If things go bad, he explained to Mary Catherine, you get them down there and you don't come out until I give the all clear. What about you? She asked, though she was afraid of the answer. I'll be doing what I was trained to do. The grimness in his voice left no room for argument. Samuel proved surprisingly adept at the military-style preparations. Thomas taught him to load ammunition, to maintain equipment, to move quietly through the forest around their cabin. The boy absorbed every lesson with the intensity of someone who understood that lives might depend on his competence. It was during one of these training sessions that Mary Catherine realized how much Thomas was risking by protecting them. She found him on the ridge above the cabin, studying the approaches with the eye of someone who had planned many battles. You could leave, she said quietly, settling beside him on the rocky outcrop. Take your horse and disappear deeper into the mountains. No one would blame you. Thomas didn't look at her, but she saw his jaw tighten. Is that what you want me to do? I want you to be safe, she said honestly. I want you to live. I've been living for 15 years, Thomas replied. What you and the children gave me these past months, that's not living. That's something else entirely. Mary Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Thomas. He turned to face her then, and the intensity in his expression stole her breath. I love you, he said simply. I love Samuel's courage and Rebecca's joy and James's trust. I love the way you hum while you cook, the way you worry over them even when they're safe in their beds. I love having a reason to wake up in the morning and something worth protecting at night. The confession hung between them in the mountain air, honest and raw and terrifying in its completeness. I love you too, Mary Catherine whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. But Thomas, if something happens to you because of us, nothing's going to happen to me, he said firmly. And nothing's going to happen to you or the children. I promise you that. It was a promise no man could reasonably make, given what they were facing. But the conviction in his voice, the steady certainty of someone who had never broken his word, made Mary Catherine believe him despite her fear. That night, they held each other for the first time, sitting by the fire after the children had gone to sleep. No words, no passion, just the simple, profound comfort of two people who had found something worth fighting for. Mary Catherine rested her head on Thomas's shoulder and felt safer than she had since David died, even knowing that danger was closing in around them. The attack came 3 days later. Mary Catherine woke before dawn to Thomas's hand on her shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. His eyes were alert, focused, and she knew without being told that their time of preparation was over. How many? She whispered. 4, maybe 5. They're good came up the creek bed like I thought they might, but not good enough. Thomas moved with quiet efficiency, gathering weapons and checking positions. Get the children ready. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong, Mary Catherine said firmly, surprising herself with her conviction. You're too stubborn to die. Honest now. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. Yes, ma'am, I'm at that. As Mary Catherine woke the children and prepared them for what was to come, she caught glimpses of Thomas through the window. He moved like a ghost through the pre-dawn darkness, taking position behind the defensive barriers he had constructed. The gentle man who had carved toys and read bedtime stories had vanished, replaced by the soldier he had once been. Samuel helped get Rebecca and James into the root cellar, whispering reassurances to his younger siblings, even though his own face was pale with fear. "It's going to be all right," he told them. "Mr. Thomas won't let anything happen to us." Mary Catherine kissed each of her children, memorizing their faces in case this was the last time she would see them. Then she took her position at the window Thomas had designated, rifle in hands that were steadier than she had expected. Outside, the first rays of sunlight began to creep across the mountainside, and in the distance, barely visible through the trees, Mary Catherine could see them. Dark shapes moving with purpose toward their home, toward everything they had built together. The battle for their family was about to begin. The bounty hunters announced themselves with arrogance, born of confidence in easy prey. They rode into the clearing around Thomas's cabin as if they owned the mountain. 5 hard men on horseback with weapons drawn and greed in their eyes. "Fletcher." "Family," the leader called out. A heavy-set man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." From her position at the cabin window, Mary Catherine could see Thomas crouched behind the woodpile he had strategically positioned 50 yards from the front door. He remained perfectly still, invisible to the men below, but she knew he was. Calculating distances, angles, threats. "We've got legal warrants," the scarred man continued. David Fletcher robbed the Cattleman's Bank in Kansas City. His family's wanted as accomplices. "You folks harboring them are breaking federal law." One of the other riders, a thin man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. "Maybe they ain't here, Garrett. Place looks awful quiet." "They're here," Garrett said with certainty. "Track them through 3 territories. This is where the trail ends." He raised his voice again. "You got 1 minute to send out Mary Catherine Fletcher and her kids, or we come in shooting." Mary Catherine's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. In the root cellar below, she could hear James whimpering softly and Rebecca trying to comfort him. Samuel crouched beside the trapdoor, his slingshot in his hands. Not much of a weapon, but he was determined to contribute to their defense. The minutes stretched endlessly. Then Garrett nodded to his men, and they began to spread out, surrounding the cabin with practiced efficiency. That's when Thomas made his move. The first shot came from the woodpile, taking down the rider moving toward the north side of the cabin. The man pitched from his horse with a cry of surprise and pain, and suddenly the morning exploded into chaos. "Sniper!" Garrett shouted, wheeling his horse toward cover. "Behind the woodpile!" But Thomas was already moving, using terrain and obstacles. The way only someone who truly knew this land could. He appeared and disappeared like smoke, each shot carefully placed, each movement calculated to maximize advantage. The bounty hunters had expected to face a frightened family, maybe an overprotective neighbor. They had not expected to face a trained cavalry soldier fighting on ground he had chosen, prepared, and fortified. Mary Catherine watched through the window as Thomas systematically destroyed their advantage. When one of the men tried to circle around the cabin's east side, Thomas was waiting behind the chicken coop that had never held chickens, but made excellent cover. When another attempted to use the lean-to stable for protection, he found that Thomas had anticipated that move as well, but 5 against 1 were still difficult odds, no matter how skilled the one might be. "Mary Catherine," Garrett's voice cut through the gunfire. "I know you can hear me in there. Your protector's good, but he can't watch every angle at once. Send out those kids, and we'll make this easy on everyone." Mary Catherine's hands tightened on her rifle. Through the window, she could see one of the bounty hunters working his way along the creek bed, trying to reach the cabin's blind spot on the south side. Thomas was pinned down behind the blacksmith's forge he had constructed, trading shots with 2 men who had taken cover in the tree line. The man by the creek was getting close. Too close. Mary Catherine made a decision that terrified and empowered. her at the same time. She opened the cabin's side window, took careful aim the way Thomas had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, splintering bark from a tree 6 feet to the left of her target. But it was close enough to make the bounty hunter dive for cover, and more importantly, it let Thomas know where the threat was coming from. Thomas's answering shot was not wide. The man by the creek crumpled and lay still. "Samuel!" Mary Catherine called softly. "The stone by the fireplace, can you reach it?" Samuel nodded and crawled to the loose stone Thomas had shown them. Retrieving the slingshot ammunition he had prepared, small, perfectly round stones that could be deadly in skilled hands. Samuel's hands, trained by weeks of practice and sharpened by desperate necessity. When the next bounty hunter tried to use the distraction of gunfire to approach the cabin's rear window, he found himself under attack from an unexpected quarter. Samuel's first stone caught him in the temple, stunning him long enough for Thomas to finish what the boy had started. 3 down. 2 to go. But Garrett was smarter than his companions, and he had realized that direct assault wasn't going to work against their mysterious defender. Mary Catherine saw him gesture to his remaining partner, saw them pull back to regroup and plan a different approach dot in the temporary quiet that followed. She could hear Thomas calling softly from his position behind the forge. "Mary Catherine, you and the boy all right in there? We're fine," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good shooting," Thomas replied, and she could hear the pride in his voice. "Keep watching that south window. They're not done yet." Garrett's new strategy became clear when smoke began rising from the back of the cabin. They had circled around to the blind spot on the west side, where the cliff face provided cover, and set fire to the lean-to stable that adjoined the main building. "Thomas!" Mary Catherine called out in alarm. "Fire!" She could see Thomas assessing the situation from his position, could almost read his thoughts as he calculated how long they had before the flames spread to the main cabin. Not long. The winter had been dry, and the wood was seasoned and ready to burn. "Samuel," Mary Catherine said urgently, "get your siblings out of the cellar. We may have to run." But Samuel was already moving, having understood the danger without being told. He pulled open the trapdoor and helped Rebecca climb out, then lifted little James up into the main room. "Mama, I'm scared," Rebecca whispered, clutching her cornhusk doll. "I know, sweetheart. But remember what we practiced. If we have to leave the cabin, you stay close to me and do exactly what I say." Through the window, Mary Catherine could see that Thomas had realized their desperate situation. The fire was spreading faster than expected, and soon their fortress would become their trap. He had to end this now, before they were forced out into the open with no cover. What happened next was like watching a master craftsman at work. If that craftsman's medium was violence and his canvas was life and death, Thomas moved from his defensive position with sudden, devastating purpose. Instead of trying to put out the fire or retreat, he went on the attack. He broke cover and charged directly toward Garrett's position, using speed and surprise to close the distance before the bounty hunter could react. Garrett got off one shot that went wide, and then Thomas was on him. The two men went down in a tangle of arms and legs, rolling through the dirt and fighting for control of Garrett's rifle. Thomas was older, but he was lean and strong from 15 years of mountain living, and he fought with the quiet desperation of a man defending everything he loved. The remaining bounty hunter had a clear shot at Thomas while he struggled with Garrett, but as he raised his rifle, Samuel's slingshot sang through the morning air. The stone caught the man in the shoulder, spoiling his aim and causing him to stumble backward. It was the opening Thomas needed. He broke free from Garrett's grasp, rolled to his feet, and had his service revolver in his hand before the scarred bounty hunter could recover his own weapon. "It's over," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the blood running from a cut on his cheek. Garrett looked up at him from the dirt, his face twisted with rage and frustration. "You killed my men. Your men came here to hurt my family, Thomas replied. What did you expect would happen? Your family? Garrett spat. These people are criminals. That woman's husband robbed a bank. David Fletcher's dead, Thomas said simply. Has been for months. And his wife and children never hurt anyone. Mary Catherine emerged from the cabin with her children, keeping them close as they approached. The two men. The fire in the lean-to was spreading, but slowly now. Thomas's quick action had saved them from being trapped inside. Garrett's eyes fixed on Mary Catherine, with greedy calculation. $500 for you and the kids. That's a lot of money. Not anymore, Thomas said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch heavy with the sound of gold coins. This is the money David Fletcher stole. All of it. Mary. Catherine gasped. Thomas, how did you... Found it sewn into the lining of James's coat, Thomas said quietly. Your husband hid it where he knew you'd keep it safe with his youngest child. Garrett's eyes went wide with greed, but Thomas's gun never wavered. Here's what's going to happen, Thomas continued. You're going to take this money back to Kansas City. You're going to tell them that David Fletcher is dead and his stolen gold has been recovered. Case closed. And the woman and children? Garrett demanded. What woman and children? Thomas asked mildly. I live alone on this mountain. Always have. Garrett stared at him, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're asking me to lie to federal marshals. I'm asking you to take back what was stolen and close a case that should have been closed months ago, Thomas corrected. Everyone gets what they want. The bank gets its money back. You get your bounty for recovering the gold, and my family gets to live in peace. Your family, Garrett repeated slowly. Thomas moved his gun slightly, a subtle reminder of who held the power in this negotiation. My family, he confirmed after a long moment. Garrett nodded slowly. He understood that he had two choices. Take the gold and the story Thomas offered, or join his dead companions in the mountain soil. The gold's all there? He asked. Every coin, Thomas confirmed. David Fletcher may have been many things, but he wasn't a spender. Garrett struggled to his feet, favoring his left side where he had taken a hard fall during his fight with Thomas. And if I ever come back this way? You won't want to, Thomas said with quiet certainty as the last bounty hunter rode away with David's stolen gold. Mary Catherine felt a chapter of her life finally close. The past that had haunted them was truly buried at last. 3 months later, Mary Catherine stood in the doorway of what was no longer just Thomas's cabin, watching her children play in the meadow where the first wildflowers of spring had begun to bloom. The lean-to stable had been rebuilt, stronger than before, and attached to it was the foundation of an addition that would give them proper bedrooms and a real kitchen. Samuel was teaching James to whittle, the two of them sitting on a fallen log with their heads bent together in concentration. Rebecca had set up her art studio beneath a spreading pine tree, her collection of drawings now numbering in the hundreds. She had filled a dozen makeshift canvases with scenes of their mountain home, but her latest work was something special. Detailed portrait of all 5 of them together, standing in front of their expanded cabin. It's for our new parlor wall, she had explained to Mary Catherine that morning. Every family needs a portrait. Every family. Every family. The words still made Mary Catherine's heart skip with wonder and gratitude. Thomas emerged from the barn where he had been working on the cradle, not for any immediate need, but because, as he had said with a shy smile, a man should be prepared for all possibilities. The sight of him still took her breath away sometimes, this quiet mountain man who had saved them all, and then let them save him in return. The preacher from Silver Creek will be here next week, he said, settling beside her on the cabin's new front porch. If you're still sure about this. Mary Catherine twisted the simple gold band on her finger, not the wedding ring David had given her, which now rested with him beneath the mountain stones, but a new one Thomas had crafted himself, from gold he had panned from their creek. It was rough around the edges, imperfect, but it was theirs. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, leaning against his shoulder. The wedding would be small, just their family and perhaps a few neighbors from the distant homesteads. But it would make official what had been true in their hearts for months. They belonged to each other now, bound not just by necessity or gratitude, but by love that had grown slowly and surely through the long winter months. Samuel looked up from his whittling and waved at them, his face bright with contentment. At 30 now, he was growing tall and strong, still carrying the responsible weight of the oldest child, but no longer bearing it alone. Thomas had taught him to hunt, to read the weather, to build and repair and plan for the future. But more than that, he had given Samuel something precious, the knowledge that it was all right to be a boy again sometimes. "Papa Thomas," James called out, using the name that never failed to make Thomas's eyes go soft. "Come see what I made." Papa Thomas. The title had evolved naturally over the months, and no one had questioned it or made a fuss about it. It simply was, the way the best and truest things in life often were. Thomas rose to examine James's latest creation, a wooden horse that bore a strong resemblance to the one Thomas had carved months ago, but cruder, more childish, infinitely precious, for being the work of small hands guided by love rather than skill. "That's fine work, son," Thomas said seriously, and James beamed with pride. Mary Catherine watched them together and thought about the strange paths that had led them all to this moment. David's death had seemed like the end of everything, but it had been a beginning too. Thomas's long exile and grief had been preparation, not punishment, a season of learning solitude so that he would truly appreciate the gift of family when it came. Even David's crime, terrible as it was, had served a purpose in the end. The return of the stolen gold had satisfied the law and closed the book on their fugitive status. They were free to build their future without looking over their shoulders, free to love without fear. "Mary Catherine," Thomas said, returning to sit beside her. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" "Second chances," she said simply. "How sometimes the worst storms really do bring us exactly where we need to be." Thomas nodded, understanding as he always did. "Your first husband gave you beautiful children and taught you how to love. My first wife taught me how to be a husband and father. We're not replacing what we lost, we're building on it." That evening, as they sat around their fire, a family now in every way that mattered, Rebecca presented her finished portrait with great ceremony. In her childish but heartfelt rendering, they stood together in front of their mountain home. Thomas tall and protective, Mary Catherine serene and strong, Samuel growing into manhood, Rebecca bright with artistic passion, and little James safe in the center of it all. "It's perfect," Mary Catherine said, and meant it absolutely. "We're perfect," Thomas corrected gently. "Not individually. God knows we all have our rough edges. But together, we're exactly what we're supposed to be." As night settled around their mountain home and the children prepared for bed, Mary Catherine reflected on the year that had brought them from desperation to joy, from strangers to family. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and blessings, but tonight they were safe, loved, and home. Outside their windows, the same wind that had once carried only cold and loneliness now whispered promises of spring, of growth, of futures bright with possibility. And inside their warm, strong walls, 5 hearts beat in rhythm with the eternal truth that love, once found, is worth every risk required to keep it. The mountain that had been Thomas's prison had become their sanctuary. The storm that had nearly destroyed Mary Catherine's family had delivered them to exactly where they belonged. Sometimes, the worst storms really do bring us exactly where we need to be.